This past Thursday, I had a presentation for the Jung psychology group that meets next door, and my topic was on what's known as bimodal consciousness. It sounds strange, but it's the idea that people have, we all have two halves to our brain, a right half and a left half, and those have some similar functions, but they also are differentiated and have different functions. The left half, for example, which controls your right side of your body, for most people, is the side that has language. And maybe because of that, or in connection with that, it also has a more objective perspective on things. We use it for analysis, and it's particularly helpful in times of stress, in reaction to dangers or threats or the need to control things. The right half of the brain is more integral. It's more relational, more a part of things, holistic in a sense. But it doesn't, for the most part, have language. It's a long story. It was a good discussion. But, and it may be primarily a metaphorical area, significantly true, whether or not the neurological descriptions are physically factual, or at least as simple as the theory would make out. And one conclusion that I reached was that the more over human history, the more stressful life became, the more that left side, that ability to respond to fear and solve problems, became emphasized with its objective analysis, and the effect of that is a distancing from things, but then also a loss of the capacity for an experience of that integrated wholeness. And I think that this theory, maybe just because I was working on it this week, but I think this theory can help us understand the experience of Pentecost that we're celebrating today. We speak of Pentecost as a coming of the Holy Spirit, but it's possible to think about it as rather an opening up of a capacity to experience the Spirit that's always there, but is usually, at least in the modern world, hidden. I noticed there's some lines in our earlier entrance hymn that would seem to indicate that the Spirit is always there, and it's our perceptions that change. The Greek word for truth really means unhidden. So if we're speaking about the Spirit that's often hidden, when it emerges, we experience the truth. And the gospel talks about that too. Whatever it was, this experience of the Spirit was absolutely transformative for the early followers of Jesus. They had been totally devastated by the execution of Jesus, the crucifixion. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, and they didn't know what to do. But then on Easter, they experienced the risen Christ. They experienced Jesus as somehow, though dead, still alive. And that gave them hope again. But they still didn't act, it seems like. They still hung out together in the upper room, afraid maybe, or not knowing what to do. But then came this wind, the breath, the tongues of fire. It says that the enthusiasm, the Greek word enthusiasm means to be, for God to come inside you. And that was their experience. They could communicate their faith in ways that they previously would have thought impossible. Working on the sermon at the same time as I did the Jung talk, I noticed that this whole idea of their speaking in tongues as other languages that people could understand, which is the idea that's put forth in the Acts of the Apostles written by Luke, is an interesting relationship with that passage from Genesis that we read for the first lesson. Sorry, they were turned around in the bulletin. But that fits with what I was talking about Thursday night. The Genesis story of the Tower of Babel marks really the start of civilization. It's the Bible's way of talking about the beginning of civilization on the plain of Shinar there. And civilization was what later Abraham leaves when he's called to follow God. That's the way of the world. There's a different way to follow God. In my bimodal consciousness theory, civilization and the stress especially that it created was a big event that forced people much more into this left brain analytical alienated condition. It created the subject-object split that separated people from each other, separated people from the world, and is symbolized by our speaking in these mutually unintelligible languages. It brought the dominance of what we know today as the ego, as the center of life, and we were cut off from an experience of a kind of higher self that was more integrated. The experience of the Spirit, as Luke tells it in Acts, reverses that alienation, using language in a sense to transcend itself. Their words open things up rather than narrowing things analytically down. It united people rather than separating them. All those different people that Liz pronounced their names so well. I've often had people just say, oh, well, the Persians and Medes and a lot of other people. But now, St. Paul talks about the Spirit and what he talks about as the speaking in tongues in a different way. He writes earlier than Luke does. For Paul, this special speech isn't really a universal human language the way that Luke talks about it, but it's the language of angels, he says. It's a gift of the Spirit that's used for prayer, and through spiritually inspired interpretation is used to receive divine revelation. So, the stories about the Spirit, the twin stories of the resurrection and the coming of the Spirit, are one way over time that the church came to explain how this tiny, insignificant first century sect in a fairly out-of-the-way part of the Roman Empire went on from the execution of their central leader and teacher to outlast the empire itself, to go on and transform the world over the past 2,000 years. It is pretty amazing. And when the church has flagged, when it's been corrupted, when it's been stuck in the compulsive habits of the past that have outlived their sacramental value, the sense of the living presence of Jesus and a renewed onrush of the Holy Spirit have brought renewal and reform, have brought healing and transcendence again and again and again in different ways. Not without danger, mind you. There is tremendous power in spiritual experience, and power is always a double-edged sword. If instead, for example, of transcending and letting go of control in an openness to spirit, we end up trying to have our left brain ego-controlled selves empowered by the Spirit. When we try to use the Spirit for something, we end up in a kind of psychological and spiritual inflation. In trying to possess the Spirit, we end up being possessed ourselves. Just like an idol is the result of trying to objectify the divine, maybe a demonic spirit could be the result of objectifying spirit. It's not so much a difference in the quality of spirit, but a difference in the way that we're trying to relate with spirit. Trying to grasp, trying to hold, trying to use. These stories about spirit in the New Testament, the ones from Luke and in Acts today, the discussion of it, extensive discussion of it in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, are the church's attempt then to try to keep the Spirit within some boundaries, to make it color inside the lines so it doesn't go all over the place and cause disruption. The church has been revived by spiritual movements, but they can get pretty wacky at times. They can become socially and psychologically and religiously pretty dangerous, especially for certain susceptible people. In the 15th century, Girolamo Savonarola had this great spiritual renewal and ended up destroying the art and the culture in Renaissance Italy because he thought the Spirit inspired him to do that. It's just kind of like last week, I think Iran closed down 567 restaurants or something because they were playing illegal music. It's the same sort of attempt to use spirit. We've seen charismatic preachers again and again get caught in greed and sex and power because it is a powerful thing. Offshoot Christian cults that you see growing very fast in Africa, South Latin America, take over. You look at places like Waco, Texas, and other things like that. It can be a destructive thing if we're not careful. You mess with tongues of fire in the wrong way, you're probably going to get burned. Now, in America, denominations that are spirit-focused try to compensate for that often by becoming morally rigid and very legalistic, by having pretty simplistic theology and a kind of paranoid literalism that's a defense against this spiritual excess. But that in itself doesn't always work, and it also brings, I think, damage. It grieves the Spirit in other ways. We need to be open to this part of our faith, but I think without being repressive like often happens, or legalistic. I think that the structures of governance and worship in the Episcopal Church help us interface with this power in ways that are protective, that do keep us safe, but also allow an opening up and a invitation to this renewed aspect of life that our society, even more than time of the Tower of Babel, has closed us in and kept us apart. We need, as Jesus says, to be in love. Jesus tells Philip and the apostles, don't be afraid. So don't be afraid. There is incredible life and joy and potentially truer experience than we've ever known in a life of the Spirit. And we need to celebrate that and enjoy that and share in that Spirit, that God or life or reality or however you want to talk about it, the way that God has shared with you. Thanks be to God.